Good afternoon, good morning to our global audience. I'm Mo Horowitz, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at Solargik. And thank you for joining us today. We will be discussing a growing trend in global pipelines for solar PV. How do you build solar on challenging terrains? We will be joined by my colleague, Tuvya Friedlander, our Senior Director of Project Engineering here at Solargeek. Tuvya, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Mo.
Fantastic. So as we discussed, we're seeing more and more projects globally, be that in the Northeast, in the US, in Italy, Portugal, in Southeast Asia. We're seeing more and more projects becoming or being deployed on challenging terrains. And we have the benefit of, and maybe the fun job of building some of these. So Tuvia, before we jump in, can you give our listeners a little bit of a background on yourself and where you meet these projects?
For sure. So I think that basically my background comes from the civil engineering world and project management world. I've worked a lot in the world of infrastructure, of energy efficiency, and renewable energies. And coming from that background, from the more project-oriented background, and coming to a technology provider like Solargik, which is basically we're providing our trackers, gives that mix of product and project. And yeah, it's a very interesting way to look at the different projects that we work on because we're coming at it from a different perspective, not just saying this is our product, make it work, saying, okay, what is this project and what are the constraints and how do we deal with it?
Fantastic. So I think for today, Tuvia, let's try to sort of start at the 30,000 foot level and then slowly drill down, pun intended, right, and sort of dive deep. So let's start in a few words. How is your approach, our approach, different in terms of how we're dealing with challenging terrains? And let's also set the stage for what this does for a project's IRR, profitability, right? And at the end of the day, building on slopes is not hard from just an engineering perspective. It's how do you do that in a financially viable way? So maybe just a few words on how is our approach different than others in the market in terms of how we're addressing these types of challenging terrains.
Okay, great. So I think that the approach comes in two phases, basically. So one phase is looking at it on the product level, on our tracker, and how a tracker basically, because it's a smaller tracker that's more depth that we can easily play with, which directions it's going and how big the trackers are. So we can approach it in that way. And then also in terms of the project level, we're able to look at the project and understand what are the pain points of the project, what are the things that are important. Specifically, if we go into IRR and we talk about, the many factors that impact IRR in the project. You've got the equipment cost, you've got the machinery cost, if you've got other works on site, and once you really understand on the project level how your product can impact for better or for worse in different ways. So we try and look at the projects in that way and really trying to adapt our product and say, okay, this is our product, but we are adaptable. And how does our ability to be more adaptable and more flexible help get a better IRR in these projects?
Fantastic. You and I were talking about this recently, but we were both listening to Maxim Markovich's PV Magazine webinar, Maxim from PV Farm. And our listeners, I would highly recommend going back and listening to it. I thought it was a really interesting discussion around what are the levers that you can pull when you're doing a general design of a farm, not necessarily for challenging terrains. But Tuvia, when you sit down and you're looking at a site, like what are the sort of three biggest levers, three biggest decisions that you need to make up front? Because once you do those, right, obviously there's cascading effects during the line. So just as you think of it, what are sort of the three biggest decisions that you need to make up front when you're approaching this type of a project?
So specifically in the area of challenging terrains, one of the big things to really understand and a big part of it is keeping it in sync with the developer and understanding what the developer's abilities are and their contractor specifically. So for example, is earthworks an option at all, right? When we come to these projects with challenging terrain. So for a lot of people, it's obvious that you're going to have to do earthworks. And for a lot of players, it's a real big pain in the neck also in terms of permitting, in terms of timeline, when they want to get these projects up and running.
Agrivoltaics, right? We've done a few recent ones where in agrivoltaics, you can't do any earthwork in some of these situations, right? So that's probably a big deal as well.
Exactly. So once you go into the world of agrivoltaics, so if you're going to even a lot of the projects now, when you talk about portfolio projects that aren't the hugest projects, each one for itself, but you have a good amount of projects. So what's really important there is to keep things simple, keep them in sync with the contractor, with the contractor's abilities. So that's a big thing. Like, can you or can you not do earthworks? And to try and in a lot of cases, most people say avoid it as much as possible, or at all costs avoid. A really big thing to take into account is what are the contractor's abilities, what the machinery abilities, specifically when we get to very high slopes. Not every machine can work on every slope. For sure you can find in a lot of places very high-tech machinery or very advanced machinery, but it becomes extremely expensive. It becomes more rare. You might have to wait longer for that machinery to be available to work on your site. And also in a lot of markets, this machinery isn't available at all. If you're going to smaller countries, you'll find machinery that's relatively simple, and then you cannot go into these higher slopes. So understanding, number one, that side of it, but then also obviously there's the side of what are our trackers specs, where can we work, what are the things that impact the tracker's design. So basically overall I'd say there's the standard thing of understanding the boundaries, understanding the energy specs of the site, but then it's not just that, it's also understanding what are the pain points for the developer, for the customer, for the contractor, and how do you take all of that into account and really use your tracker and product's ability to take full advantage of that site.
I like that. So in a sense, it's sort of looking at what are the general constraints in which you have to play, sort of, right? Who are your friends in the sandbox, and not necessarily just the design yet, but sort of what are the broader constraints, right? As we said, we're starting broad, we're going deeper. So we have the context, you figured out what the specific constraints are for this equipment, for the developer, permitting, contractor. You look at all those together, your first step is coming up with a design. Right? What does it mean to you maximizing energy in that design, right? How do you get the most energy out of a constrained site from the design perspective, right? Like what's going into that design?
So when we speak about PV plants, a lot of times when we talk about maximizing energy, the first thing that comes to mind is like, how do you get the most production out of the site? Or how do you get the most kilowatts out of the site, or install the capacity on site? And often when I think of it coming more again from the project oriented perspective is energy is how much energy you got to put into actually building the site and getting it up and running. And if we go back to IRR, so IRR is basically efficiency. What's the best way to get value for money, or the bang for the buck? And this is basically where we come and say, okay, look at it from a more holistic approach, really understanding the constraints, and then obviously to say within those constraints, what is the best way to go about the layout, go about which trackers we're going to use, and what's the best way to go about it. And whether it's taking more advantage of the site's boundaries in different ways.
Tuvya, I just realized something, and not something that we had discussed specifically for today, but if you have any thoughts, I think it's be interesting. And I'm thinking specifically of, let's say, a project, you and I designed in Sweden, where we actually designed for profitability and not necessarily for maximizing energy, right? And for our listeners, long story short, there was time of day pricing and seasonality in effect, and we actually designed a site that produced less energy, about 10% less energy overall, right? But it was 30 to 40% more profitable because it was generating the energy during winter months in that specific location. So, Tuvya, do you have anything that comes to mind on recent projects that you worked on where, for example, we designed not just for generating more energy, but in general, generating more profitability, right? In terms of either increasing the pitch to get more energy in the shoulder, something of that sort, where it wasn't just how much, but it's also the when we're generating, which is obviously a bigger concern in many markets now with things like batteries coming online. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So obviously, as you brought up that specific project, so that was a very extreme case and a very interesting case. So there've been different cases where, for example, to price of installation, complicated installation. So we've gone in certain directions with our product. Or for example, where we've had very, very high slopes and then said, how are we going to, if we want to change the angle of the trackers in terms of, instead of going directly north on these slopes, which would have made it very, very extreme for installation. So basically take that angle, take the azimuth a bit and reduce the slope, sort of like you're into cycling. So if we're going up a hill, and you have to use your own legs to get yourself up there. So often what we'll do is we'll weave our way up the hill to reduce the slope. So if you think of the same thing, instead of taking the trackers going straight up, and you're actually doing a bit of a slope and take a bit of an angle. So we're reducing the slope, we're reducing the angle of attack. And by doing that, actually making it possible to install on these sites. And then with a similar type of idea, basically, we've had sites when we've had boundaries that have basically said, if we use trackers that are going completely north-south, so the pitch is going to be very low in order to get to a certain capacity. Whereas if we're taking these trackers and putting them at a bit of an angle, so we've actually managed to get either high capacity or to get a better pitch and then get better production. So it's things that are sort of thinking out of the box, taking things a little bit differently, and through that being able to take more advantage of, the sites, more advantage of the specific boundaries that we have, and get to the best production that we can for those specific sites. Considering their local project constraints.
I have you touched on this a little bit before, but I want to, maybe come back to it. You and I can sit right in the classroom in our offices and design something beautiful on paper, right? The ink will take, the paper will take any ink, all those expressions. That's the easy part. This is what I was going to say. But Mike Tyson, the famous philosopher, right? Like, he knows everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And sometimes you have to take other constraints into account, right? So how do you build something? How do you design something that can actually be built? How do you address, let's say, the EPC or machinery constraints, right? How do you design it in a way that can also be built decently, easily in the field, rather than just, looking beautiful on paper and not being very practical?
First thing, there's nothing like Mike Tyson's quote, so it's always great to bring him in, as long as he doesn't bite us. So I think that as you say, we've got all these ideas. We have a product, we have the basic design rules, or, how to approach a project. And I'll give an example. We had a certain project, very, very challenging terrain. And then on top of that, also the project's location meant very high snow loads and very high wind loads. Basically, what happens is your foundations have to be really strong, and the track obviously has to be really strong in order to deal with the loads from the slopes and the snow and the wind and everything else. And then once we had got to the foundation design stage for this project, we saw that basically it was very, very problematic, right? So the ground was not as stable as we would have liked it to have been, which means that we're going to have to use really deep piles and bigger piles in order to be stable there. To this specifically, also, this is a project where permitting reasons you cannot do concrete or anything else to make it more stable. And basically what came out there is we needed really long piles once you take the tracker access into account and also the depth underground. And when we went to discuss this with the client, basically when we're talking about slopes that are very high and very high piles, we understood together that to find machinery that would be able to install these piles would basically be impossible. And here's a very important part of the project and the design process of saying, okay, we understand that we have a product. We understand that there's a project, but that doesn't always mean that, the two can't meet each other. And how do you take a product that's relatively adaptable and adapted to a project and specific need? And in this specific case, what we did, because we understood that this would have been very problematic in terms of finding people that know how to install deep piles, long piles on very steep slopes, and to bring machinery to site would be very expensive, we actually ended up adding more piles to the tracker. So you're splitting the load over the piles, meaning that you can have shallower piles and use more standardized machinery. And generally speaking, I mean, when you come from the tracker world, you want to reduce as much as possible the amount of piles that you have. But in this case specifically, what we saw that actually the price of the machinery, if we had passed some sort of turning point, would have become really, really bad for the developer. Obviously, we don't feel that as much. But if we give them the solution of providing more piles, having more piles of the tracker, shorter piles, we actually solve a lot of issues. And that type of thinking, I think, is one of the big things that differentiates us. And really, when we are in these design phases with our customers, understanding their pain points, understanding what's important to them, time to market, and all these different things, we can be more creative and help them solve issues while we're going. So that's basically, that was a big hit in the face, a big, nice Tyson hit. But at the end, to come out of it, and that's the trick, to come up with solutions that are feasible.
I like that because I think it's a really good example of something that's very, very it's two things. It's one is really, really practical, right? It's a very practical design decision that we're able to make in order to accommodate the customer. And I think it's also a really good example of something that I think to us internally at this point, it's almost it's obvious, right? And that is that rules of thumb are meant to be broken, meaning they're there for a reason, right? And there's a reason they're there, but if you can look beyond them, right, and you have the tools and the ability to look beyond them sometimes, then yeah, there are situations in which we want to bend them. And the way you described it made me think a little bit of what we talk about when we're talking about building on slopes, for example, right? That what we're doing is we're trying to force our trackers to fit the slopes rather than forcing the slopes to fit our trackers, right? And there's this
Exactly.
question of, okay, each one has pros and cons, but at the end of the day, sometimes, as you just described, it might be overall better to make that specific foundation a little bit more challenging because the fixed cost of needing to bring for, a heavy machinery or wait for it to be on site or availability, it will just outweigh something else. Even though, yeah, there are downsides for that other choice. In this case, they might be outweighed by something else. And maybe just to continue on that, you talked a little bit about the constraints, and we talked about having a plan, but then things don't always go as you wanted. What are some of the biggest mistakes or most common mistakes you see in terms of constructability, right? Like we issued the bill of materials, we delivered the tracker to the site, we even built a golden row, and now the customer or the EPC is taking over and starting to build, right? Like, what are some of the biggest or most common mistakes that we're seeing people make that maybe our listeners can hopefully avoid in the future?
I think when you come to high slopes and changing terrain, one of the most challenging things is to get your piling right in terms of the locations, in terms of the heights, because as the slope changed, the torque tube that we're using for our tracker, its distance doesn't change, but at the end, we have to get our piles in the right location to make sure that we're taking the slopes into account, to take not just the local slopes, but the average slope over the tracker. And here it becomes really complicated, also on the design level and also on the construction level. So on the design level, there's a lot of tools that we've developed and tools that belong also in the market, and they're relatively available in order to do that design, to figure out your reveal height, to figure out where you're going to have collisions, how to deal with them. And here also comes into a lot of questions. If you're having collisions with your panels onto the ground, how do you deal with it? Meaning, do you deal with a collision with the ground using earthworks, or part of the way that we come at these things is say, okay, each tracker we can by itself, and each tracker is relatively short. And then that specific tracker, we can come and limit the tracking on the software level. And by having that control on the software level, we can actually say, okay, we might not want to do earthworks here. Here we can limit the tracking. And this is where the software and the control and the ability to control our trackers, we're basically, again, not on the design level, here on the software level, adapting ourselves to the terrain and not saying that the terrain has to adapt to us. And then that goes into a whole different conversation, which I'm sure one day you'll have a talk with our technology team and our algo team on basically how to do these very advanced backtracking algorithms, taking into account, the changing terrain also in the east-west direction. Now your backtracking isn't just standard backtracking on a flat terrain, but it changes during the day and where your trackers are, one compared to the other with height. But that's in a different call altogether. But to know that you have that ability is really helpful also on the design level, and also to come to the client and you can be very open and honest and say, listen, we see some issues in different areas. These are the options. Option number one is to go in to do earthworks, and then you'll have no issue. Option number two is to say, okay, we're happy to do some limited tracking in this area. How do you feel about that? How does that affect performance, if at all? And it's an interesting conversation and a good one to be able to have.
That's really cool. And right, I think we're sort of, again, we started high. We're now in extremely sort of specific, great examples of real world decisions, lessons learned. Something I always like to ask our guests, which I think creates like the most interesting insights, is give me a few examples of the most surprising, intuitive choices you had to make, right? Like everybody's going this way. We weighed the facts and then realized actually we need to do this, which you would typically not do, right? Like you mentioned thinking out of the box before. Recent projects you've worked on, what are sort of the most counterintuitive out of the box decisions that we're making.
Think that going back to that example that I gave before, right? When we have boundaries that are not, I guess they don't exactly complement an exact north-south axis of the trackers, which when you're in the tracker world, that's, you're always looking north. Or if you're, and as these boundaries come at more of an angle, or if we have terrain that says, okay, if I attack this at a different attack angle, then I can install on those terrains. And then the question comes along, okay, well, what does that do to my performance? And I think that is one of the most interesting things, is that like when you actually go and you look at the numbers and you run the simulations, you'll see that the impact to performance when you're going at these type of angles is actually relatively low, obviously to a certain point. And having that flexibility actually does open up a lot of doors. Sometimes it's completely irrelevant and, the rule of thumb goes and it's the best way to go. But in some cases, when you come and you actually use these type of solutions, you can get to much better, either getting more DC on site or getting better performance, having a higher pitch. And I think that's one of the things that, when I saw that the first time, it was very hard for me to believe how off north you can actually go, what azimuth you can take, with having very little impact on the performance of the site. That for me was a real eye-opener. Wow, I had to really see the numbers and dig down into it to feel confident to come to customers and say, yeah, what do you think of this? And basically they always react the same way, is that no way, I have to see the numbers. They see the numbers and they're like, okay, cool.
Now, Tuvya, one thing and this is something that we see differently in, let's say, North America versus Europe, and maybe it's more prevalent also in DG, distributed generation projects versus utility scale, we'll see different customers who are more comfortable with, let's say, strings being divided across rows, right? In many cases, rule of thumb, keep, right, like don't break a string across trackers. But just thinking again, counterintuitively, we know that in some projects where we needed high power density and there was maybe a high PPA, right, or offtake agreement, and it actually made sense to prioritize more generation versus efficiency. Can you say a little bit about that and sort of how we've maybe made that decision at times to decide if we're going to break up a string or not?
Yeah, so basically in most of our projects, we're trying to respect that. Also, it makes having a design methodology, and also in terms of the ability to build these sites fast and the ability to maintain them clearly and, understanding each string where it is, it's extremely helpful throughout the lifetime of the project. But as you said, there are projects where taking advantage of, going back to the Swiss cheese example, it's basically impossible. And if you're going to stick to that methodology, which is fine, you're going to pay a price for it, right? So obviously, you're paying the price, but you're going to enjoy it on the ability to build quickly or the ability to maintain very easily. But the price that you're going to pay is how much DC you're going to get on site, or the row spacing or whatever else it is. And then once we've come there, basically there's a lot of ways to say, anyway, you're going to have this infrastructure that's taking the rows of trackers, taking the strings, bringing it to the inverter. And once you're taking advantage already of the fact that that infrastructure is there and saying, okay, we can split a string over 2 trackers at the edge of a site in certain situations, and also often taking that design and saying, okay, but we'll have a set way to split a string. So even that, you create a methodology that's easy to build and easy to maintain. So actually you can take much more advantage of the site and you can maintain and build relatively easily. So I think people are being, with sites that are coming out today and the need to develop them and the want to develop them, people are more open to being more flexible in general and understand that the need to be flexible and the need to take more advantage of the site. There's actually a lot of benefits to it. And okay, you pay somewhere, but you benefit more in other places.
Wow, fascinating. Tuvya, this has been really, really fun. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. To our listeners, if you want to learn more about Solargik, you can find us on our website, solargeek.com. You can find us on our LinkedIn, where we put out more and more of our content and our pictures and videos. Or you can reach out to us at info@solargeek.com. And thank you very, very much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.